I spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from surgery, and my husband never visited me even once. Not one single day, out of 14. This was the same man who had sat beside me through every appointment, held my hand through every scan, and kissed my forehead the morning they wheeled me into the operating room, promising he'd be right there when I woke up. Then everything went quiet. And when I finally walked through our front door after 2 weeks away, I stood there in the doorway and stared, because nothing in 20 years of marriage could have prepared me for what I found waiting for me inside my own home. Welcome back to Betrayal Stories. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because every week we bring you real stories about the people we trust most and the moments that reveal exactly who they really are. My name is Claire Whitman, and this is the story of the 2 weeks that ended my marriage, and the one moment in my own doorway that finally showed me the truth. Mark and I had been married for 20 years. 20 years is long enough to know someone's coffee order without asking, to finish their sentences at dinner parties, to develop a shorthand built out of 1,000 small inside jokes that nobody else would ever understand. 20 years is also long enough to believe, genuinely and completely, that you know a person all the way down to the foundation. I want you to hold on to that thought as I tell you this story, because it matters more than almost anything else I'm about to describe. We met in our late 20s, both of us working entry-level jobs at the same marketing firm downtown, both of us broke in the specific, hopeful way people are broke in their 20s, when being broke still feels temporary rather than permanent. Mark proposed 2 years later at the restaurant where we'd had our first date, nothing extravagant, just a simple ring and an honest, nervous speech about wanting to build a life with me. We got married the following spring, bought our first house 4 years after that, and built, over 2 decades, the kind of steady, ordinary life that doesn't make for exciting stories at dinner parties but that I had always considered, quietly, to be the thing I was proudest of. 2 decades of showing up for each other, through job losses, through the loss of Mark's father, through the slow, patient work of simply choosing each other again and again, year after year. About 4 months ago, I started experiencing severe stomach pain, the kind that would come in waves and then disappear for days, making it easy to dismiss as something minor, stress or bad food or simply getting older. When it got bad enough that I finally saw a doctor, the initial exam turned into blood work, and the blood work turned into imaging, and the imaging eventually turned into a diagnosis that required surgery, a mass that needed to come out before it became something far more serious than it already was. I want to be clear that in the weeks leading up to that surgery, Mark was, by every visible measure, the husband I had always believed him to be. He came to every single appointment, sat in every waiting room, asked the surgeon detailed questions I was too anxious to think to ask myself. He held my hand during the consultation where we discussed the risks of the procedure, and I remember him squeezing my fingers so tightly during the part about potential complications that it actually left a faint mark on my skin afterward. The night before the surgery, he made my favorite dinner, something we hadn't done together in years because our schedules had gotten so busy, and afterward he held me on the couch and told me he wasn't going anywhere, that he'd be right there in the waiting room the entire time, and right there when I woke up. The morning of the surgery, he drove me to the hospital before sunrise, held my hand as they prepped me, and kissed my forehead just before they wheeled me back, telling me, one more time, that he'd be waiting when I opened my eyes. I remember that kiss specifically, because it's the same act of tenderness that makes what happened next feel so genuinely impossible to reconcile, even now, months later, even after I know the full truth. The surgery itself went as well as these things can go. The mass was removed successfully, the pathology came back with better news than we'd feared, and by every account, I should have had a relatively short recovery, maybe 4 or 5 days in the hospital before being discharged to recover at home. But my body had other plans. A post-surgical infection developed on day 3, followed by complications that required a second, smaller procedure to address, and what should have been a 5-day hospital stay stretched into nearly 2 full weeks. Mark was there for the first 2 days after the surgery. I want to note that clearly, because it matters to the timeline of what happened. He sat beside my bed, brought me ice chips, adjusted my pillows, held a bucket for me during a rough night when the anesthesia and pain medication combination made me sick. On the morning of the third day, he told me he needed to run home to shower and grab a change of clothes, since he'd been sleeping in the recliner in my hospital room for 2 nights straight. I told him to go, to take care of himself too, that I'd be fine for a few hours. He never came back that day. He texted me around dinner time, said something had come up with a work emergency, that a project deadline had blown up unexpectedly and he needed to handle it, that he'd be back first thing in the morning. I remember feeling a small flicker of disappointment but nothing more than that, because Mark's job in commercial insurance did occasionally throw genuine emergencies at him, and 20 years of marriage had taught me that work crises, however inconvenient the timing, were sometimes simply unavoidable. He didn't come the next morning either. Or the morning after that. By day 5, I had gone from mild disappointment to a slow, building confusion that I couldn't quite name. Every time I texted him, asking when he'd be able to visit, he responded, always fairly quickly, always with some version of the same message. He was sorry. Things were crazy right now. He'd explain everything once things settled down. He loved me and hoped I was healing well. The responses were warm enough, on the surface, that I couldn't point to anything specific and call it wrong, but underneath the warmth was an absence so total and so out of character that it started to feel, by the end of the first week, like I was texting a stranger wearing my husband's phone number. I called Mark's sister, Karen, on day 6, partly out of genuine worry that something might be wrong with him that he wasn't telling me, and partly, I think, because some part of me was already looking for someone to help make sense of what was happening. Karen was vague in a way that struck me as strange even in the moment, saying only that Mark had a lot going on and that I shouldn't worry, that he'd explain things when he was ready. Looking back, I understand now that Karen almost certainly knew more than she let on that day, but at the time, I simply filed her vagueness away as one more confusing piece of a puzzle I didn't yet have enough information to solve. My best friend, Denise, came to visit me almost every single day during those 2 weeks, and I remember, more than once, catching a strange look on her face whenever I brought up Mark's continued absence, a look I couldn't quite place at the time but that I now recognize, in hindsight, as someone who knew something and was actively trying not to be the one to tell me. By the second week, I had run through nearly every explanation my mind could construct. I wondered if Mark had gotten sick himself and didn't want to worry me while I was recovering. I wondered if there had been some kind of family emergency on his side that he was trying to shield me from during my own health crisis. I even wondered, briefly and then dismissed the thought as unfair, whether he was simply overwhelmed by the fear of almost losing me and was processing that fear by avoiding the hospital entirely, a coping mechanism rather than a betrayal. I want to be honest that I spent considerable energy, during those long hospital nights, constructing sympathetic explanations for his absence, because the alternative, that my husband of 20 years was simply choosing not to show up for me during the hardest 2 weeks of my life, felt too painful to seriously entertain. I was discharged on a Thursday afternoon. Mark texted that morning to say he had a work commitment he genuinely could not move, and that a car service would take me home instead, and that he would be there waiting for me when I arrived. I remember feeling a strange mixture of relief and dread reading that message, relief that this strange, silent 2 weeks was finally about to end with some kind of explanation, and dread, a low, persistent hum of dread that I couldn't fully articulate but that sat in my stomach the entire ride home. The car service dropped me off in front of our house around 3 in the afternoon. I remember standing in the driveway for a moment before walking up to the front door, looking at the house we'd lived in for 16 years, the flower beds I'd planted myself, the porch swing we'd installed the summer after Mark's father passed away, and feeling an overwhelming, disorienting sense that I was about to walk into something I wasn't prepared for. I used my key, pushed open the front door, and called out Mark's name, expecting, I think, some version of the tearful, apologetic reunion I'd been quietly hoping for during those long hospital nights. Instead, I stood frozen in the doorway, staring into my own living room, because nothing about what I saw made any sense against the life I thought I'd been living for the past 20 years. There were women's clothes that were not mine, draped over the back of our couch. There was a suitcase, open, half unpacked, sitting in the corner of our living room where our reading chair usually stood, the chair itself pushed awkwardly against the wall to make room. There was a coffee mug on our kitchen counter, one I didn't recognize, with lipstick faintly visible on the rim, sitting next to Mark's favorite mug like they'd shared breakfast together that very morning. And there, walking out of our bedroom, wearing one of Mark's old college t-shirts like it belonged to her, was a woman I recognized immediately, because I'd met her at least a dozen times over the years at company holiday parties. Her name was Ashley Coleman, a co-worker of Mark's, someone I had exchanged pleasant small talk with at those very parties, someone I had genuinely liked, in the shallow way you like someone you only see once a year in a festive setting. I don't remember exactly what I said in that first moment, standing frozen in my own doorway. I remember Ashley's face going white, her scrambling to grab her things off the couch, mumbling something about how this wasn't what it looked like, a sentence that has never once, in the history of infidelity, actually meant that it wasn't what it looked like. I remember Mark coming out of the bedroom behind her, his face doing this strange, cowardly thing where guilt and defensiveness fought for control of his expression at the same time, and neither won cleanly. The full story came out over the following several days, in pieces, first from Mark, in a series of conversations that started with excuses and slowly, painfully, moved toward something closer to the truth. Mark and Ashley had been having an affair for just over a year, something that had started, according to him, as an emotional connection during a stressful work project and had escalated, gradually, into something physical. He told me, and I want to include this detail because I think it matters to understanding the full shape of the betrayal, that he had genuinely intended to end things with Ashley multiple times over that year, but had never followed through, partly out of cowardice and partly, he claimed, out of a confused, tangled sense that he still loved both of us in different ways, a claim I found almost more insulting than a simple confession of pure attraction would have been. When I was diagnosed and scheduled for surgery, Mark told me he had genuinely intended to end things with Ashley before my hospital stay, had even told her as much, but that the stress of my diagnosis, combined with genuine fear about the surgery's risks, had sent him spiraling in a way he wasn't proud of. Rather than leaning on me, or on his own family, or on any healthy source of support during that fear, he had turned back to Ashley, the person who had become, over the past year, his primary emotional outlet whenever things got hard. The first 2 days after my surgery, when he genuinely was by my side, were real. But once the initial crisis passed and I moved into the slower, less dramatic phase of recovery, he told me the isolation of the hospital, the boredom, the guilt he was already carrying about the affair, became, in his own words, too much to sit with alone, and he went to Ashley instead of coming back to me. What started as one night away turned into him simply not being able to face walking back into that hospital room and looking me in the eye, not because anything more urgent was happening, but because the longer he stayed away, the more the guilt compounded, until returning felt, to him, somehow harder than simply avoiding the entire situation and hoping it would resolve itself before I came home. He told me, and this detail still makes my stomach turn every time I think about it, that he had actually planned to have Ashley gone from the house, everything cleaned up and put away, before I was discharged, and that the only reason I walked in on the scene I did was that my discharge had happened 4 hours earlier than the estimated time he'd been told, catching them both completely unprepared. I want to pause here and talk about something that I think matters more than the affair itself, which is the specific cruelty of the timeline. Mark didn't disappear during some ordinary, low-stakes week of our marriage. He disappeared during the 2 weeks I was most physically vulnerable, most afraid, most in need of the partner I had built 20 years of trust with. And in those 2 weeks, rather than sitting with his own fear and guilt in any kind of honest way, he chose comfort, chose avoidance, chose an affair partner over a wife recovering from major surgery, and constructed just enough plausible-sounding excuses to keep me hoping rather than confronting the truth sooner. Karen, Mark's sister, eventually admitted that she had known about the affair for nearly 8 months before I found out, having discovered it herself when she saw Mark and Ashley together at a restaurant she happened to be at with friends. She told me she had wrestled constantly with whether to tell me, ultimately deciding, in her words, that it wasn't her place to interfere in our marriage. I understand, to some degree, the difficulty of that position for a sibling, caught between loyalty to a brother and basic decency toward a sister-in-law of 20 years. But I also cannot fully forgive the 8 months of silence that allowed this to continue, that allowed me to keep building a life with a man who was actively deceiving me the entire time, right up through the most frightening medical experience of my life. Denise, my best friend, admitted something similar, that she had suspected for a few months, had noticed things, comments Mark made, a strange energy at a dinner party months earlier, but had never had concrete proof and hadn't wanted to plant seeds of doubt without something solid to point to. I understood her hesitation more easily than Karen's, honestly, because Denise at least had genuine uncertainty rather than direct knowledge, but it still meant that for months, I had been the only person in my own life who didn't know the truth about my marriage. I moved out of our house within 3 weeks of coming home from the hospital, staying with Denise while I figured out my next steps, still recovering physically from the surgery while also processing the collapse of a 20-year marriage all at once. I want to be honest that those first few weeks were some of the hardest of my entire life, harder in some ways than the surgery itself, because physical recovery, however painful, has a predictable trajectory. Emotional recovery from a betrayal like this does not follow any predictable timeline at all. I filed for divorce 2 months later, once I'd had enough time to think clearly rather than react purely out of the initial shock and pain. Mark, to his credit, did not contest the divorce or try to minimize what he'd done during the proceedings, something I've come to appreciate more with distance, even if it doesn't undo the 2 weeks of silence and deception that led us there. The divorce was finalized just under a year after I found Ashley's suitcase sitting in the corner of my living room. I've had a lot of time now to reflect on what happened, and I think the thing that still sits with me most isn't even the affair itself, painful as that was to learn about. It's the specific choice Mark made during those 2 weeks, the choice to let me lie in a hospital bed constructing sympathetic explanations for his absence, rather than simply telling me the truth, however difficult that conversation would have been. I think, if he had come to me honestly, even mid-affair, even in the middle of my hospital stay, and said something like, "I've made a terrible mistake and I need to tell you about it," I might have respected that honesty, even while being devastated by the content of it. What I couldn't forgive, in the end, wasn't just the betrayal of the affair. It was the deeper betrayal of watching me suffer in confused uncertainty for 2 weeks rather than simply telling me the truth and letting me decide, with full information, what I wanted to do next. I'm doing well now, almost a year and a half removed from that afternoon in my doorway. I kept the house in the divorce settlement, repainted the living room a color Mark always hated, and slowly, room by room, made the space feel like mine again rather than a place haunted by a suitcase I never asked to find there. I started seeing a therapist, something I probably should have done years earlier for entirely unrelated reasons, and I've learned more about myself in 18 months of genuine reflection than I did in the previous 20 years of quietly assuming I understood my own marriage completely. I heard, through mutual friends, that Mark and Ashley's relationship didn't survive more than a few months once it was forced out into the open air, once it had to exist as a real relationship with real accountability rather than a secret escape from real life. I won't pretend that news didn't bring me some small, uncharitable satisfaction, though I've also worked hard, in therapy, to not let my own healing depend too heavily on whatever happens in Mark's life going forward. I think about that moment in the doorway often, the moment I stood frozen looking at a stranger's suitcase in my own living room, because it was the exact moment 20 years of assumed understanding collided with a truth I had never once suspected. I used to think that 20 years together meant you truly knew someone, all the way down. I understand now that 20 years together means you know someone as well as they're willing to let themselves be known, and that even decades of genuine love and partnership can exist alongside a hidden second life, running quietly underneath the visible one, until something forces it into the light. I don't regret the 20 years I spent with Mark, not entirely, because so much of what we built together was real, even if the ending revealed something I hadn't known was there all along. But I've learned, in the time since, that real love doesn't disappear the moment things get hard. It doesn't need 2 weeks of silence and a stranger's suitcase to hide behind. And I'd rather spend the rest of my life alone than spend one more day accepting anything less than that as the baseline for what I deserve. If you've ever discovered a betrayal that completely rewrote how you understood your own relationship, I want to hear about it. Tell me your story in the comments below. And if this story kept you hooked from beginning to end, make sure you subscribe to Betrayal Stories so you never miss the next one. We've got a lot more coming, and some of these stories will surprise you just as much as this one did. See you in the next video.